It's 1999, and you're at a baseball game in Southern California. A small-time college baseball game, Long Beach State versus Sacramento State. The stadium in Long Beach is about 10% full. Maybe you're there to cheer on a friend or classmate who's on the Long Beach team. Or maybe you're there because baseball has been on your mind lately. It's been on a lot of people's minds lately. Joe DiMaggio, one of the sport's all-time greats, has just died a few weeks ago. You dimly wonder if there will be any commemoration of him at the baseball game. There is, but it doesn't look like what you're expecting. It doesn't look like anything anyone is expecting. Before the game, the announcer declares that David Woodard, director of the Long Beach Chamber Players, is going to be performing a classical piece he wrote in memory of Joe DiMaggio, a requiem, Woodard calls it, titled Farewell to the Yankee Clipper. Woodard, a tall, pale young man with horn-rimmed glasses and a smudge mustache, wheels a heavy pump organ out to home plate. Two people hold up a giant number 56, which was not DiMaggio's jersey number. He was number 5 on the Yankees. 56 refers to DiMaggio's legendary 56-game hitting streak in 1941, sometimes called the greatest achievement in baseball history. Woodard, who is not a baseball fan, will later claim that he wrote a piece for DiMaggio because of his own mystical admiration for the number 56. Woodard begins to play. It sounds like shit. A reporter says he played, quote, every key at once. Several other unnamed associates of Woodard, dressed as Gandalf-like wizards with pointy hats and long fake beards, begin to run up and down the aisles. Smoke begins to pour from the organ, like a performance by the band who are the bad guys in a Disney Channel movie where the climax hinges on a battle of the bands. A discordant but unmistakable rendition of Take Me Out to the Ball Game emerges from the mess, confirming that yes, Woodard is not just warming up, he does know how to play the organ, that is how he wrote it, and this is how it's supposed to sound. The organ begins to catch fire. The performance is between 5 and 6 minutes long. Woodard will later claim that that was one of several hidden 56s in the piece. Who is this guy? Nobody really knows. The Long Beach Chamber Players don't exist. A few people in the Los Angeles art scene respond to journalists' queries with, ugh, that guy. Comparisons to P.T. Barnum and Andy Kaufman are tossed around, implying that he's a perpetual showman, living as a self-created character, never letting the mask slip in public. Woodard tells an Orange County Weekly reporter that baseball is significant to him because he got injured playing ball at age 8 and his mother, an anesthesiologist, let young David inject himself with anesthesia after the accident, resulting in David overdosing and having his first psychedelic experience. Woodard gave the reporter his mother's number to confirm the story. The reporter calls the number, the person on the other end introduces herself as Virginia Woodard and says she has never been an anesthesiologist. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jollibee the Durian, Thimble the Doll, and Sluds the Shoggoth, and welcome to the biggest, most bonkers episode I've ever done of Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. You know what's one of my guilty pleasure movies? David Lynch's Dune. Denis Villeneuve made the definitive version of the trippy sci-fi epic, but you gotta give David Lynch points for trying. How can you knock a movie where Sting, as in the 80s rock star, wears this? Also, how can you watch it? It's on Netflix in the US, but it's leaving next month. Fortunately, I have a VPN from Private Internet Access, PIA. Now I can just bamboozle my computer into thinking I'm in another country, and now I can once again enjoy Kenneth McMillan doing this. Besides, now if I connect to a server in, say, South Africa, advertisers won't be able to keep tabs on me. I'll get fun South African ads instead. Maybe they'll think I'm a dashing Xhosa Dune fan. South African viewers, please correct me on that tongue click. I practiced it a lot, but the more I practice something ahead of a video, the more likely I am to screw it up. Anyway, the terrifying panopticon of the internet won't know my next move. With servers in 91 countries, coincidentally the exact same number of countries Jollibee the Durian is classified as a lethal weapon in, PIA offers the most coverage, most security, and most cross-platform reliability of any VPN anywhere. I've tested PIA all over the world, and they've always worked, including in countries that have real chips on their shoulders about what you use the internet for, like China, or worse, the UK. By using my link in the description, piavpn.com/tourscabinet, you can get 83% off on private internet access. That's just $2.03 a month, and you also get 4 extra months completely for free. Today we return to familiar territory for Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. The bread and butter, you might say, of this channel. The internet's last best place, the free encyclopedia, Wikipedia. I've said this a lot in my videos, but it bears repeating because it doesn't get said enough. Wikipedia does not allow itself to be messed with. Who would win? Some troll who wants to poison the public well of information, or the combined forces of every autistic special interest in the universe? It's the autists, every single time. A few episodes ago, I did a spiel about how the historical events we know the most about are the ones that are the least common because people like to write about interesting, unusual things. Such is the case with Wikipedia tomfoolery. I've devoted some of my most watched episodes to it, but that's because it's so difficult to carry out a Wikipedia grift that really sticks. Any truly successful, or even momentarily successful, case of large-scale Wikipedia vandalism is a unicorn. A curiosity worth talking about. And this, well, this is the most curious of them all. This episode covers perhaps the strangest event in Wikipedia's 2-decade history, the saga of David Woodard. Not too long ago, I made an episode about the mystery of Corbin Bleu, why this B-list Disney Channel actor, best known for being on the basketball team in High School Musical, somehow had one of the most translated pages on all of Wikipedia. This episode is a lot like that, but weirder. Corbin Bleu, for a time, had one of the most translated articles among people living or dead. At one point, only Jesus and Obama had more languages available for their Wikipedia page. But in terms of the most translated wiki pages overall, Corbin Bleu was never anywhere near the top. Neither was Jesus, nor Obama. Because the most translated pages on Wikipedia do not belong to people. You can look up a list of the most translated pages, and typically the top 50 or so are almost all countries, roughly in order of their international influence. Other high-ranking pages include ones for the sun, the moon, the earth, globally spoken languages, and Wikipedia itself. The title of the most translated page on all of Wikipedia fluctuates, but it has most commonly been the page for the United States. It has never been a person. Until late 2024, when the page for the US was surpassed in scope by the page for David Woodard. If that's not ringing any bells for you, good, because it didn't ring any for most Wikipedians either. Who the hell is David Woodard? This mystery is a lot more intense than the Corbin Bleu mystery because, for one thing, David Woodard got to #1 on the list of most translated pages and stayed there for months, something I didn't think was possible. Corbin Bleu's page never rose that far. The mystery there was simply, why did it rise as far as it did? And all due respect to Corbin Bleu, who is a great guy, he is not, in himself, a curiosity. David Woodard, meanwhile, is one of the weirdest fuckers I've ever covered on this channel about weird fuckers. I'm gonna do something I've never done before in this episode. There are so many tangents loosely connected to David Woodard that could be their own episode that a few times I'm gonna do side stories where I talk about some of the people and things David Woodard encountered over the course of his Tor's Cabinet ready life. Again, I first teased this episode months ago at the end of my Corbin Bleu Wiki Mystery episode. Back at that point, not a lot had been discovered. Today though, Wikipedians have gone to work. If you like this episode, consider rewarding it with a donation to the Wikimedia Foundation. I couldn't have done it without them. To introduce David Woodard and the scene he came out of, one must talk about the 90s. And And in order to talk about the 90s, or at least the aspect of the 90s relevant to the Woodard story, one must talk about the 25-year nostalgia cycle. It is a truth of our times that in order to be considered a person of good taste, you must think that everything from 25 to 30 years ago was the epitome of cool, and everything 10 to 15 years ago was the lamest cultural era ever. This is why everybody loudly claims to hate stomp, clap, hey music now. You know, the joyful, exuberant folk pop hits made in the early 2010s by the likes of the Lumineers and Mumford & Sons. That, and the whole beard-trimming, IPA-drinking hipster scene it came out of, was a fun cultural era, but right now it falls into the dreaded 10 to 15 years ago valley of uncoolness, so line up, citizen, for your 2 minutes hate against the idea of flannel-wearing guys having a good time. There is nothing new under the sun. The stomp clap hey backlash reminds me of the disco backlash, the period in the early 80s when the coolest thing in the world was to declare that disco sucks. It left a long cultural shadow. We still say that things are deader than disco, but do you know anyone today who actually doesn't like disco? God knows I like disco. We've even rewritten the history of the disco backlash to make the disco haters not just wrong, but problematic, because disco was invented in gay clubs by Black and Hispanic people, so now hating disco makes you a racist and a homophobe. But that's pretty clearly not what was on people's minds amid the disco backlash. There was never a Motown backlash. Most of the biggest disco hits were by straight white people. Disco was hated because it belonged to the previous decade. It's gonna be a while before we realize Stomp Clap Hey was good, but it'll happen, just like it happened with disco. And that'll probably happen in the late 2030s, when the 25 to 30 year nostalgia cycle hits the 2010s. Just a few years after Mumford & Sons were big, there was a ton of 80s themed stuff in the mid-2010s because that was where the nostalgia cycle landed. In fact, I think the defining features of 2010s pop culture were the Brooklyn hipster aesthetic and, then, 80s nostalgia. The moment we no longer heard banjos on the Billboard charts, suddenly every pop song was produced by Jack Antonoff to make it sound like it was a cut by Depeche Mode in 1984. Stranger Things was big. I figured after that we'd have a wave of 90s nostalgia, but that barely showed up, and we sort of seem to have culturally skipped 90s nostalgia. Right now, everything 2000s, or Y2K as we've decided to call it, is big again. This has been going on ever since we've had a sense of decades as definable cultural eras, which arguably began with the 1890s. The 1990s saw a burst of renewed interest in the trippy 60s. That, too, had been cast on the cultural pyre in the 70s, just like disco and folk pop later would when they, too, approached their 10th birthday. Every 70s music and culture movement, punk rock, disco, early hip-hop, even prog rock, which was the clearest continuation of 60s psychedelia, all of those carried undertones of sneering at the hippies. Well, by the 90s, the former hippies were running the world, and sneering at the hippies was itself an uncool thing people in previous decades did. While it never became the main cultural thrust of the era, a history of the 90s would be incomplete without talking about how everything 60s, especially the weirder elements of the 60s, were cool again. Terrence McKenna would appear on stage at raves and talk about magic mushrooms and DMT machine elves. Jam bands like Phish came back into style. 2 disastrous attempts were made at holding a new Woodstock. While those failed, the 90s did end up creating its new Woodstock, Burning Man. 60s counterculture fed into 90s cyberculture. A quarter century after the Summer of Love, the new revolution of consciousness growing in the Bay Area was the internet. Timothy Leary came out of the woodwork and began talking about how the personal computer will be the LSD of the 90s, an actual quote. Leary began advocating for space migration, increasing intelligence, and life extension, an agenda he wrapped up in the neat acronym SMILE. In fact, acknowledging that we didn't seem to get a 90s nostalgia movement when we'd be expected to in the late 2010s and early 20s, I think the post-rat, techie, hippie community that I'm part of may be the closest thing we got. Isn't Timmy Leary's smile not too different from Tescriel? It's in this scene of 90s neo-psychedelia in California where David Woodard first surfaced. He had been raised in Ventura on the coast northwest of Los Angeles, born in 1964 to a mother who was probably actually a housewife, and a father originally from Iowa who had been a DJ in the 50s, a small-time journalist during the time he was raising David, and interestingly became the, quote, resident storyteller at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library when that opened in nearby Simi Valley in 1991. David Woodard claims to have studied at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music in the 80s and moved to Napa Valley in 1987. There, Woodard discovered what is arguably still the main thing he's known for, if he's known at all, the Dream Machine. Not Dream Machine, that's a brand of alarm clocks. The Dream Machine, one shared M in the middle. What's a dream machine? This is a dream machine. And with that, it's time for a side story. David Woodard was the popularizer of the dream machine, but he was not its inventor. That honor goes to one Brian Gysin, a writer and artist whose entire life seemed to consist of inventing fun, weird things that ended up being popularized by and associated with other fun weirdos. Gysin was an accomplished man behind the man. Born in the 1910s, raised in Canada and England, he moved to 1930s Paris to be part of the surrealist scene, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Dali, Picasso, and Magritte. There, Gysin was cancelled. 19-year-old Gysin had his first art exhibition taken down by his fellow artists on its opening day, and he was officially expelled from the Surrealists by their founder André Breton. Precisely why is lost to the sands of time, but I think it's fair to say that this is just what happens in tight-knit communities of quirky, highly driven people with big egos. There's probably no huge crime lurking in Brian Gysin's past. Gysin served in World War II, and then wrote a book about the history of American slaves who fled to Canada. By the 1950s, he was back in Paris, with a new group of eccentric artists, the Beat Generation. As you probably know, the Beat Generation, or beatniks, were a subculture of free-spirited experimental writers in the 50s who were basically proto-hippies. The drug culture of the 60s in particular owes a large debt to the influence of the beatniks. Gysin became friends with William Burroughs, most famous as the author of The Naked Lunch, a hallucinatory novel that gained a cult following in the 60s counterculture. The Beatles included Burroughs in the collage of people they admired on the Sgt. Pepper album cover. Burroughs also wrote a novella in 1979 called Blade Runner, a movie.
Reminds me of my favorite movie, The Movie.
If you're a movie buff, you'll know that the movie Blade Runner, which came out in 1982, was based on a book by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The title Blade Runner did not come from Burroughs. Ridley Scott got it from a third book, a sci-fi novel written in 1974 by one Alan E. Nourse, which has no other connection to the movie Blade Runner, but it does have a connection to the book Blade Runner, a Movie, because Burroughs wrote that one as a treatment for a movie based on Nourse's book. Now that there was a major movie called Blade Runner, based on an entirely different book, neither Nourse nor Burroughs would get the chance to adapt either of their books called Blade Runner as a movie, but Burroughs' Blade Runner book did end up being made into a movie in 1983 under the title Taking Tiger Mountain, which was originally going to be a completely different movie based on Albert Camus's novel The Stranger, and was retooled midway through production to be based on Burroughs' Blade Runner book. That's a tangent, but it's really not, now that I think about it. Burroughs' writing was all about confusion, delirium, nesting of concepts. This is really that is really this. It is psychedelic literature par excellence. The baffling array of stories titled Blade Runner feels like something that would happen in a Burroughs book. Blurring the line between reality and fiction was central to the writing of the Beat Generation. Make art where the medium is your life. Burroughs is usually cited as the father of the cut-up. Do you have a bunch of magnets on your fridge with common words on them that you can rearrange to form ridiculous sentences? That's more or less a cut-up. A serious author would say that when you're doing that, you're following in the footsteps of William Burroughs. Burroughs made the cut-up his own, rearranging news clippings and ad copy into some genuinely fascinating short stories and poetry. Here's an example of a cut-up he made from an article on juvenile delinquency. Solemn accountants are jumping ship, sir. All of them, sir, in the last skimpy surplus, sir. Room for one more outside, sir, they said, and plunged 7th teenage future Molotov cocktails. Last seen swimming desperately in sewage. Allies wait on knives. Valiant crowns drew a short 22 and heavy commitments. The Caribbean swells to a roar. A Negro snapped the advantages. Street gangs, Uranian born, up from a headline of penniless migrants in the face of appalling conditions. Out show window and were proud. But Burroughs didn't invent it. Similar techniques were used in the writings of the Dadaists and Surrealists of the 1920s and 30s, which may be what subconsciously inspired Brian Gysin to reinvent the cut-up for the Beat Generation. While staying with Burroughs at a shitty hotel in Paris, so no frills that it didn't have a name, later nicknamed the Beat Hotel by its famous residents, Gysin was slicing papers with a razor blade. Not sure what he was slicing papers for, but either way, he had several layers of newspapers spread out on the table under the paper he was cutting to protect the table from the razor blade. Picking up the newspapers, he realized he'd sliced the news articles into bite-sized pieces that could be rearranged in interesting new ways. Gysin and Burroughs ended up publishing plenty of poetry and fiction together, and Burroughs called Gysin, quote, the only man I ever respected, though Gysin never became a literary legend like Burroughs. In my opinion, Geisen's cut-up writing is a lot more interesting and feels less rudderless than what Burroughs did. They wrote a few books of cut-up poetry together, but I can tell what's Burroughs and what's Geisen because Geisen's cut-ups feel like they're about something. They all seem to get at something beyond the source material they're assembled from. Not to call William Burroughs talentless, he clearly was a genius, but I think Burroughs got famous as a writer and Geisen didn't just because Burroughs was so much more of a character. Okay, so Burroughs and Geisen and friends living at the Beat Hotel were bohemians. What defines a bohemian? It's a know-it-when-you-see-it kind of thing, but I think 4 very important elements. You make quirky art, you live in a big city, you're poor, and you do drugs. Am I a bohemian? Those latter 2 things tend to conflict. Drugs are expensive. So it was that one day in 1961, Brian Geisen was dozing on a bus in France, and as the trees outside caused a strobing effect against the setting sun, he had a revelation that he could have a psychedelic experience without drugs.
As I was riding down a road and closed my eyes in the back of a bus and had these extraordinary visions, which I thought at that time were some kind of spiritual grace which had been allotted to me. But I found out later that this was a purely physiological, neurological effect.
So Geisen decided he had to find a way to replicate this effect in his dingy hotel room. With the help of an engineer friend of his, since he was clearly no shape rotator, Geisen invented the Dream Machine, a deceptively simple device. It consists of a light bulb surrounded by a rotating cylinder with slits in it. You're supposed to close your eyes, but not too tightly, and watch as the strobing effect of the light supposedly induces hallucinations. Now, doesn't that sound like a recipe for an epileptic seizure? Yes it does. According to people promoting the thing, 1 in 4,000 adults and about twice as many children will experience seizures looking at a dream machine. If you're concerned about your safety, maybe stick to drugs. Does it work? Unclear, but surprisingly, the answer is not a hard no. The 2008 Canadian documentary Flicker interviewed a whole bunch of counterculture figures from the 60s and beyond, including Mick Jagger's sometimes girlfriend, Marianne Faithfull, members of Sonic Youth, and the iconic experimental musician Genesis P-Orridge, all people who clearly knew their shit about psychedelics and came away with some surprising Dream Machine testimonials.
I turned around, I looked at it, I just watched it for a while, and as you saw, it starts to go in and out. You start seeing, and then it looks like it's slowing down and speeding up, and then I closed my eyes, and immediately a flood of angels flew out of the night, or out of the starry sky, into, well, it was almost indescribable, through a tunnel right past me. And it was a complete eureka moment. I just went, oh my God, this machine actually works.
That's insane, because I too have tried to sleep in a bus, train, or the backseat of a car and had my sleep interrupted by sunlight strobing through trees, and it sure doesn't make me see angels. It gives me a fucking headache. Strobing effects are fun sometimes when they don't involve bright light. I remember when I was a kid, my family would drive from where I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, down to see my grandparents in Sacramento, twice a year, in summer and at Christmas, and I'd watch the orchards in the Sacramento Valley along I-5 from the back seat. The ways that tightly organized rows of trees form interesting, illusory patterns, passing by at 70 miles an hour. But that didn't make me see God. I do think I loosely understand how the Dream Machine worked because of an article published by Scott Alexander, a writer who I'm a big fan of, about the Miracle of Fatima. The Miracle of Fatima was an incident in 1917 Portugal where tens of thousands of Catholic pilgrims witnessed the sun spin around in circles, lurch toward them, and cover the ground in multicolored light. The stories are remarkably consistent, and almost nobody says they saw nothing that day. Atheists were converted to Catholicism by the miracle. Remember the episode I made about the Zimbabwean school kids who all said they were visited by aliens at recess? That and the Miracle of Fatima are probably the 2 best corroborated mass sightings of something inexplicable and supernatural. Scott Alexander put forward the theory that Fatima was caused by the effects of staring at the sun for a longer time than is healthy under specific patchy cloud effects. In a follow-up article, Scott compares it to the Buddhist concept of fire kasina meditation, where you stare at a flame and then concentrate on the after effects, producing visuals similar to psychedelic hallucinations. I don't know if Brian Geisen knew about fire kasina meditation. I think that if any white guy in the 50s did, it would probably be him, but either way, I'm pretty sure the Dream Machine works on a similar concept. So, Brian Geisen invented the cut-up, which was popularized by William Burroughs, and the Dream Machine, which would end up being popularized by David Woodard. But his most momentous invention was this. Brian Geisen invented weed edibles. Seriously. Okay, he did not invent the concept of putting weed in food. People have been doing that for thousands of years in India and Southeast Asia, where cannabis is originally from. But Geisen did introduce it to the 60s counterculture, as well as inventing what's probably still today the world's favorite edible, weed brownies. And once again, his creation is generally credited to someone else. While Geisen lived in Paris in the 50s, another proto-hippie literary luminary he rubbed shoulders with was Alice B. Toklas, a lesbian writer who had been the girlfriend of Gertrude Stein. Toklas published a cookbook in 1954 for which her friends submitted recipes. Brian Geisen added a recipe for brownies he called hashish fudge, initially as a joke, but to his surprise, Toklas printed it. To anyone who had a good time in the 60s, the name Alice B. Toklas is synonymous with edibles. The best-selling cookbook that introduced them to the hippies doesn't credit Geisen with creating the recipe. Brian Geisen died in Paris in 1986. Allegedly, he had a friend, one David Dunlap, who owned an apartment complex in Napa, California. One of the tenants in that complex, from 1987 onward, was David Woodard. Back to the main story. What drew David Woodard to Napa in the late 80s is unclear. During that time, he claims to have worked at the city's historic cemetery, part of a lifelong fascination with death. When Woodard, then in his 20s, was introduced to the Dream Machine, again supposedly by his landlord, he felt that he had found his calling. Woodard began a business, building and selling Dream Machines. He was the first person to make them into an industry. While Dream Machine-like devices had occasionally been used by 60s artists and rock stars, thanks to William Burroughs' promotion of Geisen's invention, in those days, you had to build your own Dream Machine. No longer. Claiming to sell 30 to 50 devices a year, Woodard's Dream Machines sold for $500 for the, quote, Bohemian version, which was appropriately the cheapest model, all the way up to the $4,000 Museum Archive version, which was made of copper. This was psychedelia commercialized. In a way that fits the 90s psychedelic revival perfectly. As Calvin and Hobbes wisely put it in 1992, the revolution was a capitalist industry. Both attempts at reviving Woodstock in 1994 and 99 were backed by dozens of corporate sponsors. The 90s were suffused with a sense that capitalism had won, that the ideological final battle had occurred and there was no real alternative. The era's counterculture responded in various ways. There was the Fight Club sense of boring, trite anti-consumerism, where it wasn't that clear what you were against or what you were for, just that you were angry. Nike tried to pay Ralph Nader to criticize Nike on camera, in a Nike ad. Capitalism had won. Not only would capitalists sell you the rope you'd use to hang them, as the old Soviet adage goes, now the capitalists would proudly advertise the capitalist hanging rope for 50% off, and they'd run ads begging you to come hang them with it, knowing that you wouldn't, because you both knew there was no alternative. Capitalism had won. You could be angry about it, and plenty of people were, but nobody was so deluded as to think there was something you could do about it. Rage against the machine all you want, but nobody thought that would achieve anything. Have I mentioned how much I hate that Gen Z sees the 90s as an optimistic time? Then there was the mentality that built Silicon Valley. That was optimistic, but also I can't stress enough how in the 90s, Silicon Valley was meaningfully countercultural. That, not the social protest of the time, was the clearest direct descendant of the hippie movement. That was where the old hippies like Timothy Leary ended up. 90s leftists like Ralph Nader came from different ideological forebears. Nader first came to prominence in the 60s too, but as an activist for safer cars. If capitalism has won, said the former hippies, why not work within it to achieve that revolution in consciousness? Woodard had no known ties to Silicon Valley, but he mastered the same marriage of capitalist enterprise and hippie woo-woo. He envisioned Dream Machines taking pride of place in suburban living rooms, Dream Machines replacing television. He didn't have an advertising budget, and the major entertainment firms he claims to have approached about licensing the Dream Machine told him they were afraid of lawsuits from victims of Dream Machine-induced seizures, the same thing they told Brian Geisen when he too had tried to commercialize his invention back in the 60s. But knowledge of David Woodard's Dream Machine spread by word of mouth, reaching some surprisingly high places. Woodard was reported to have sold Dream Machines to Beck, Iggy Pop, and Kurt Cobain. Woodard's revival of the Dream Machine allowed him to ingratiate himself with William Burroughs, who was still alive, living in the college town of Lawrence, Kansas. In 1997, Woodard moved to Kansas to be closer to Burroughs, who was in his 80s and dying of heart disease. In the last months of Burroughs' life, David Woodard was probably his closest friend. Woodard gave an interview to the alternative magazine Head Press in which he told a curious reporter about his time with Burroughs. He notably said that Burroughs was attended to by 3 to 4, quote, helper boys, who would drive Burroughs to Kansas City for his methadone appointments. Burroughs was a lifelong, unapologetic heroin addict. Woodard blames the methadone clinic for Burroughs' death, saying that they were probably gradually reducing his dosage without his knowledge, a practice called blind dosing, and that supposedly shocked his body into cardiac arrest, which is something that can really happen. He might have been right. In the interview, Woodard talks about lengthy dream machine sessions with Burroughs, producing, quote, horrific hallucinations more addictive than heroin, between which they would consume, in his words, marijuana cigarettes.
And furthermore, Susan, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to learn that all 4 of them habitually smoke marijuana cigarettes.
One thing to know about William Burroughs is that he believed in magic, like seriously believed in magic. It was effectively his life's guiding philosophy. You can't really talk about Burroughs without talking about how he believed he could curse people, that he could see the future through scrying, and that he had to constantly take measures to avoid being possessed by demons. He believed his cut-ups had no artistic value. In fact, he didn't really see himself as an artist or a writer. He saw himself revealing esoteric occult truths through the randomness of things like cut-ups, since he believed nothing was truly random and all things were fated to happen. While Woodard lived with Burroughs, fellow Beat Generation writer Allen Ginsberg died of liver cancer. Burroughs claimed to have cursed him. Burroughs showed Woodard his magical contraptions. The Dream Machine was actually the least woo-woo of the many devices Burroughs and Woodard attempted to build and sell. Burroughs had also built a wishing machine, a device consisting of copper plates and an audio amplifier where you put a wish in the form of, quote, text, image, and or diorama in between the plates and then leave the machine on for 1 to 2 weeks, which is all it takes for your wish to come true. Woodard later claimed to have controlled the weather in Los Angeles for a period of several months using Burroughs' wishing machine. Then there was the Feraliminal Lycanthropizer, a doohickey that was supposed to do what Blue Sky thinks listening to Joe Rogan will do, turn a mild-mannered average Joe into a Nazi. The Feraliminal Lycanthropizer was a, quote, low-frequency thanatoauric wave generator. It generated 2 inaudibly low-frequency sound waves, 3 Hz and 9 Hz, which apparently had a variety of effects Woodard described ranging from, quote, a sensual aphrodisiac effect, to impetuously shedding the veil of clothing, to disarmoring the intimate charms of the violent child within. The overall effect, said Woodard, was thus. For example, a dilettante Catalonian national using the machine daily over a period of 5 or 6 weeks eventually managed to ingratiate himself with Adolf Hitler and persuade his quarry to adopt the swastika as high totem and emblem of the burgeoning National Socialist Conference. The reporter responded, deadpan, I'm not so sure that the world really needs tons of brutally honest, naked, horny Nazis, but to each his own, I guess. Also around this time, Woodard's Dream Machine began to get attention from the mainstream media, ranging from skeptical to sold. None other than the New York Times wrote a largely favorable piece about the Dream Machine in their Home and Garden section, in which their reporter described it inducing, quote, an unusual serenity and clarity. A German magazine, meanwhile, described buying the $500 version of the Dream Machine after 7 months of delays, for which Woodard apologized profusely in a series of verbose emails. When it finally arrived, it turned out to be nothing but a black cardboard lampshade that rotated around a dim light bulb. Sounds like that's on you for getting the bohemian version, cheapskate. And the Dream Machine got attention from the decidedly less mainstream media for decidedly more unsavory reasons. Side story time. Yes, real people thought this. Real people who were high, that is. You are probably aware that there are conspiracy theories that Kurt Cobain's 1994 suicide was anything but. If you weren't, you probably could have guessed that. There are conspiracy theories about every major celebrity death. What you may not know is that there is a point source of Kurt Cobain conspiracy theories, a cover story titled Who Killed Kurt that ran in the April 1996 issue of The High Times, which was not just any issue, it was a special hemp issue, whatever that means. Plenty of the article is dedicated to the common conspiracy theory you might have heard of, that Kurt's wife Courtney Love killed him. There are interviews with a private investigator who Courtney hired to track Kurt down after he broke out of rehab for his heroin addiction. The PI later came to believe that Courtney had murdered Kurt. Then there's the claim from a punk rocker who called himself El Duce, who said Courtney Love had paid him $50,000 to kill Kurt, although that guy was an incredibly obvious attention seeker, and members of his own band said that he made up the story so that tabloids would pay him. And then there's the claim that Kurt Cobain did kill himself, but it was induced by his dream machine use. Yes, remember how I said David Woodard claimed to have sold Kurt Cobain a dream machine? That's probably true. And according to an anonymous fax sent to the offices of the High Times, Cobain became obsessed with the thing in the months leading up to his suicide. He'd watch it for days without sleeping. Just like Woodard talked about doing with William Burroughs, he used his dream machine addiction to replace his heroin addiction. Remember, again, this is basically a rotating lampshade with slits in it. There had already been rumors of people driven insane by dream machine use. In fact, Woodard himself allegedly sent a letter to Kurt Cobain warning him of dream machine-related suicides. But he still let Kurt buy a dream machine, of course. It gets way, way weirder than this. An article in the LA Weekly covering a retrospective exhibition on William Burroughs at the LA County Museum of Art describes a scene that could have come out of the Illuminatus trilogy. Christian protesters swarmed the event, handing out flyers bemoaning Burroughs' promotion of, quote, drug addiction and homosexuality. Sure, but that wasn't their main focus. They were there first and foremost to protest the Dream Machine. This Christian group, the PAL, or Patriot Action League, purportedly had ties to another, specifically anti-Dream Machine Christian organization, the FUCK, or Friends Understanding Kurt, founded by one Steve Newman, who had played bass in a band with Kurt Cobain before he was famous. Newman later became a born-again Christian and the biggest promoter of the theory that Kurt had been driven to suicide by the Dream Machine. His organization, which he referred to as the FUCK with no apparent irony, faded into obscurity within a couple years after Cobain's death, though not after lobbying for laws to be passed regulating dream machines in the same way as cigarettes and alcohol. Years later, writing a retrospective sorta but not really apologizing for starting the Who Killed Kurt rumors, the former editor of the High Times claims that he later learned the person who sent the fax blaming the Dream Machine for Kurt's death was Courtney Love. Dun dun dun! If he has any evidence of this, he doesn't show it. Steve Newman also claimed Courtney Love believed the Dream Machine had killed Kurt, but as far as I could tell, she never spoke publicly about that, and other members of her band, Hole, denied that Kurt even had a Dream Machine at all, saying Kurt had gone to meet William Burroughs in Kansas in 1993 and used a Dream Machine there, but that was the extent of his involvement with the device. The High Times, meanwhile, clearly still wants to believe that the whole Dream Machine hoopla is misdirection and Courtney killed Kurt, which there is strong evidence against. Kurt Cobain killed himself. If you want to investigate the puzzling, maybe suicide of an angsty 90s Pacific Northwest singer-songwriter, look into the death of Elliott Smith instead. That one is actually interesting. But assuming the fax wasn't just completely made up, and I don't think it was, because how would those stoners at the High Times know Kurt Cobain had a dream machine? I have my own suspicions about who sent it. Media coverage of David Woodard has one consistent through line. He's one of those guys who wanted to become famous by any means necessary. He didn't care if he was known as a hero or a villain, he just wanted to be known. Buried deep in the early internet blog of a now-defunct magazine, the rest of their site no longer accessible, I found an interview with Woodard after Kurt Cobain's death in which Woodard kind of tries to take credit for the death, saying, quote, "The Dream Machine helped him to see that he was beginning to fall apart as a cultural figure. He felt like Andy Warhol, Wagner, and Satan rolled up into one. He was in a very special place which invited timely suicide. It seemed like it was the perfect decision. David Woodard seemed to know very well that no publicity is bad publicity. After all, this may have been the first time Woodard was tied to a famous person's death, but it wouldn't be the last. Deliberately inserting himself into newsworthy deaths was soon to become David Woodard's whole MO. A requiem is a piece of music written in memory of someone who has died. Woodard coined a related term, a prequiem. A requiem written to be played in front of someone who is about to die. Remember, David Woodard wanted to be known not just as a psychedelic lamp salesman, but as a composer, and he had real musical talent. He'd studied at the tiny, exclusive San Francisco Conservatory. Woodard's first Prequiem was written for Joe DiMaggio when the baseball great was in the hospital with terminal lung cancer. Woodard contacted the hospital about the prospect of playing it for the man himself in his hospital room. It was going to be a more elaborate affair than the piece he ended up performing, with a part including a female singer dressed as Marilyn Monroe. Again, performed in a hospital room. Woodard then retooled his idea when DiMaggio died. He was going to perform on opening day of the baseball season in Yankee Stadium. He got in contact with the Yankees PR team. They declined. He was finally forced to play it at the Long Beach Sacramento State baseball game. Some baseball fans found the prospect of a guy coming into Joe DiMaggio's hospital room to play a piece of music written to memorialize his impending death a bit ghoulish. But Woodard was just warming up. If the Dream Machine wasn't going to be his thing, Prequiems would be his thing. And they got a lot more ghoulish. In summer 2001, Timothy McVeigh, the right-wing terrorist who had perpetrated the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, was scheduled to be executed. He had killed 168 people. He had few supporters. Aha, said David Woodard, a niche nobody else has filled. And of course, another opportunity for a Prequiem. In the 2 years since the DiMaggio debacle, Woodard had built up something that he only briefly had in his life. A positive reputation with the classical music world and the city of Los Angeles. How? Well, he'd seized on another opportunity to write a requiem, and not a prequiem this time. In February 2001, the Angels Flight funicular in downtown LA had catastrophically failed, with the car at the upper station rocketing down the incline and colliding with the other car at the lower station. An 83-year-old man, Leon Prappert, was killed. Woodard, in his infinite civic-mindedness, managed to call the right people and got approved to perform a piece he'd written called An Elegy for Two Angels at the man's memorial service, attended by the mayor of LA and other dignitaries. Which may be what got the press to give him the benefit of the doubt when he said he wanted to perform a prequiem for Timothy McVeigh. This got news coverage across the country, and Woodard waxed philosophical in interviews with important publications. It just seems that a requiem should be appreciated by the dying subject in order to keep it from being a selfish endeavor by the survivors, he told the LA Times. Noting McVeigh's steadfast refusal to appeal his death sentence, Woodard told the BBC, "The way in which he has managed himself is unfathomably mindful and composed, and I feel he deserves some sort of tribute." In every interview, Woodard insisted he didn't support McVeigh, but that felt like a tacked-on disclaimer after what read like paragraphs of glazing this terrorist. He constantly noted that McVeigh was universally hated and executed at 33 years old, just like Jesus. Woodard corresponded with McVeigh in his last days, calling the mass killer, quote, extremely articulate and unshakably convinced he has done something for the good of humanity, and McVeigh allegedly wrote back saying Woodard was the only person who truly understood him. Woodard's piece was originally titled Farewell to a Saint. Under pressure from survivors of the bombing, he changed it to Ave atque vale, Latin for Hail and Farewell, although he claimed it meant Onward Valiant Soldier, which is arguably worse. Woodard wrote the piece for it to be performed in the execution chamber right as McVeigh received his lethal injection. Understandably, the prison in Indiana where McVeigh was held didn't let him. At McVeigh's own suggestion, Woodard tried to get the piece played on a local college radio station that the prisoners sometimes listened to, and the students were surprisingly welcoming to this proposal, but Woodard backed out after he learned he couldn't play it at the exact moment of McVeigh's execution. He finally performed it at a Catholic church near the prison. McVeigh never heard it. Then 9/11 happened. Guess how Woodard responded? Yeah, he wanted to write an experimental classical piece for the hijackers, even though they were, of course, already dead. This never happened because he insisted that the piece would require one particular instrument, a harp played at ancient Sumerian royal funerals, the only proper way to memorialize the hijackers, he thought. It was at a museum in Baghdad and has not been playable in thousands of years. Wouldn't it be nice if Woodard collaborated on a musical composition with another composer? Clearly anyone is less weird than this guy, right? Someone nice, hopefully, someone uncontroversial like Leonard Bernstein? Alas, the only known fellow composer Woodard ever worked with was Jack Kevorkian. If you don't know who that is, you may know him by his popular nickname, Dr. Death. Murad Jacob Kevorkian was a doctor from Michigan. His parents were ethnically Armenian immigrants from today's Turkey, and among the only members of their family to have survived the Armenian genocide. Jack grew up stubborn, isolated, and brilliant. He taught himself languages including Russian and Japanese as a teenager, picked up painting and several instruments, and completed medical school in 1952 at age 24. Specializing in pathology, Kevorkian practiced medicine in the Detroit suburbs for decades before he became a national figure. He began advertising, quote, death counseling in the late 80s, and in 1990, he carried out his first assisted suicide, aiding the death of an Oregon woman who'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She used a device Kevorkian called a thanatron, from the Greek god of death Thanatos. Kevorkian had built the thanatron out of $30 of scrap parts and carried it around in the back of his 1968 Volkswagen bus. Kevorkian was charged with murder, but a judge quickly found that since the afflicted woman had been the one to push the button on the thanatron that caused her to be injected with lethal drugs, she was the only one at fault for her death. Michigan had no law prohibiting doctor-assisted suicide, and Kevorkian was free to go. He was, however, stripped of his medical license. This didn't stop Kevorkian. The publicity he'd gotten turned him into America's most prominent activist for medically assisted dying. He used the slogan, "Dying is not a crime," and word got around that terminally ill people who wanted to end their suffering could go to Michigan and see Dr. Kevorkian. Now that Kevorkian had lost his medical license, he didn't have access to the drugs supplied through the thanatron, so he built a new suicide booth, the Mercitron, which consisted of a gas mask and a canister of carbon monoxide. With the Mercitron, Kevorkian claimed to have helped 130 people with terminal illnesses die throughout the 1990s. The state of Michigan passed a ban on assisted suicide to get Kevorkian to stop. Kevorkian was jailed, where he refused to post bail and purportedly embarked on an 18-day hunger strike. When he appealed his charge, a state court overturned the ban on assisted suicide on the grounds that it was a bill of attainder, a law passed to target one specific person, and those are unconstitutional. So, Kevorkian remained Dr. Death, even as state and national politicians constantly tried to stop him. Oregon passed the Death with Dignity Act in 1994, establishing for the first time in America a legal framework for terminally ill people to end their lives, but Kevorkian wasn't consulted on the law, nor did he relocate his practice from Michigan to Oregon. In 1998, Kevorkian asphyxiated his 100th patient. As long as he didn't directly operate the Mercitron at the moment of the patient's death, what he was doing was semi-legal. Suicide, after all, is the only act that is a crime if unsuccessfully attempted, but not if completed. You can't charge a dead man. Finally, though, the law caught up to Kevorkian after he impetuously sent a video to the news program 60 Minutes showing himself giving a lethal injection to a 52-year-old man with Lou Gehrig's disease. Now, Kevorkian's finger was on the trigger, and there was proof. He was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. When Kevorkian went to jail, some right-to-die activists didn't want him freed. Some of them breathed a sigh of relief. He was sort of to the right-to-die movement what PETA is to the animal rights movement. His style of activism consisted of outrageous, polarizing stunts meant to grab headlines. Kevorkian, like David Woodard, was a showman. He had shown up for his trial in a powdered wig and full 18th century American colonial dress, in order to claim that he was being charged on outdated laws. Earlier, he'd attended a trial dragging a papier-mâché ball and chain. In 2008, immediately after getting out of the slammer, Kevorkian ran for Congress as an independent. He got 2% of the vote. In 1997, at the peak of his infamy, Kevorkian released an original jazz album.
You like jazz?
Which was titled A Very Still Life. He played the organ, of course, but mainly the flute. In addition to jazz, he composed, quote, Bach-like pastoral pieces, according to a right-to-die organization that supported him. Kevorkian also painted, and his paintings looked like this. I'm not sure he has a single painting that doesn't look like this. And that speaks to a pretty fundamental part of Jack Kevorkian's personality. His advocacy for assisted suicide didn't seem to be rooted in any genuine empathy for the suffering of terminally ill people. Kevorkian was amoral and death-obsessed. He was Harold from Harold and Maude if he'd grown up without ever meeting Maude. Long before Kevorkian had gotten personally involved in euthanasia, when he was still a young, up-and-coming pathologist, he'd done experiments on patients dying of cardiac arrest, where he taped open their eyes to observe the process of the death of a working eye. He wrote about his findings in articles punctuated with an unscholarly number of exclamation points. In 1959, still young, Kevorkian was pushed out of the University of Michigan hospital system for writing a paper recommending that medical experiments should be carried out on death row inmates, quote, as a form of execution. The paper was titled Capital Punishment or Capital Gain. He continued to pursue this idea for the next 30 years of his life. It was only after traveling to the Netherlands in the late 80s, where doctor-assisted suicide was first being considered for legalization, that Kevorkian's interest turned toward euthanizing terminally ill people, after discovering that even pro-euthanasia Dutch doctors were horrified by Kevorkian's ideas. Kevorkian never performed medical experiments on his terminally ill patients, nor did he harvest their blood or organs, something else he had long advocated for the right to do. But he openly wished he could, and would have if the medical establishment had accepted his research. A Detroit Free Press investigation found that a majority of the patients Kevorkian had euthanized did not have a terminal illness. Over 10% of them were not in any pain. For those who did complain of chronic pain, Kevorkian rebuffed calls to send them to a pain specialist, sometimes from the patients themselves. Autopsies allegedly showed that 5 of them had no disease at all. Kevorkian's lawyers repudiated these claims without offering competing evidence, but the man himself didn't seem to see even this as a black mark against his character. When states began to legalize physician-assisted suicide in the 21st century, Kevorkian criticized these laws for only applying to terminally ill people. In his mind, everyone should have the right to medically end their life for any reason. When reporters called his death obsession ghoulish, Kevorkian would respond that yes, it certainly is. There's this funny slogan that you'll sometimes hear in corporate environments, dog fooding, or eating your own dog food. That is, if you're selling a product, you want to be its first customer. If you're the CEO of Southwest Airlines, you better not have a private jet, you better fly Southwest. If you work at Apple, don't you dare do your coding on a PC. There was a moment when it looked like Dr. Death was about to eat his own dog food. And here's where his story collides with David Woodard's. It kind of makes sense that those two would interact. Kevorkian was a serious doctor who continues to have strong defenders in the medical field despite his general sociopath vibe. He was not a borderline lolcow like Woodard, but they were both brilliant, multi-talented, spotlight-seeking, most visible around the turn of the millennium, and drawn to anything involving death, controversy, and the macabre, like a moth to a flame. When Kevorkian was put on trial in 1998, he initially announced that if he were convicted, he'd use the Mercitron on himself. He was basically trying to throw his prosecution team into a moral quandary. Is suicide bad? Well, it's in your hands to prevent one, then. According to David Woodard, who is not the most reliable of narrators, but we'll take what we can get, Kevorkian reached out to Woodard, expecting that he would be convicted, to write a prequiem for Kevorkian that would be played during his scheduled death. If that really happened, that must have felt like Christmas and his birthday and getting married and graduating from college as the valedictorian all at once for David Woodard. A famous, controversial person commissioned a piece of music from me to accompany his suicide? Oh, this is the most amazing gift I've ever gotten! Among the handful of small-time newspapers and arts magazines that wrote about this interaction between Woodard and Kevorkian, there are a lot of inconsistencies, possibly deliberately on Woodard's part. Kevorkian was a talented musician himself. Did they collaborate on composing his Prequiem, or was it just Woodard? Sometimes Woodard said one, sometimes the other. Also, what was its connection to the piece Woodard wrote for Timothy McVeigh? This all happened about a year before Woodard wrote his Prequiem for McVeigh, and some of the media reports on that story say that the piece for McVeigh had originally been written for Jack Kevorkian. Or maybe just its original title, Farewell to a Saint, came from the composition for Kevorkian. Or maybe, according to one interview, Woodard was planning a concert where he would conduct some of the pieces Kevorkian had composed. Maybe that was a separate thing. Hell, maybe Woodard never communicated with Kevorkian at all and just wrote music for him of his own accord. We don't know, because Woodard is a fabulist and Kevorkian died in 2011. He was 83 years old at that point and requested that the nurses at his deathbed play Bach. Kevorkian had suffered from hepatitis C since the 1960s, which he claims to have deliberately infected himself with in an experiment. Around the same time, a young Kevorkian and a fellow doctor named Neil Nicole, who was male, seriously considered implanting a developing fetus into Neil's abdomen just to see what would happen, both to Neil and the fetus. This is therefore the closest real thing I'll ever make to that mythical 3-hour video about mpreg that someone dreamed about earlier this year. I think those stories complete my mental model of what Jack Kevorkian was like. He was an experimenter, a mad scientist who saw himself as a latter-day Semmelweis, pushing the frontiers of medicine. He didn't love death, he loved boundary pushing, and death is the ultimate boundary. And I honestly have to respect that. But either way, Jack Kevorkian did not kill himself when he was sentenced to jail. David Woodard unapologetically told a Nepalese newspaper that he was very disappointed, and some sources say he wrote Kevorkian a letter, urging him to reconsider continuing his life. I'm sorry, friends. It's time for the time-honored Tours Cabinet reveal, the one that's been in too many episodes so far. I'm supposed to say this at the end of the episode for maximum effect, but to explain the next turn in David Woodard's life, I'm gonna have to leave it here. Yeah, this fun, wacky, weird person we've been talking about for an hour, sorry, he was a self-professed Nazi. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt when they're in the crosshairs of the world's second worst allegation. A lot of the time when other Tours Cabinet subjects have been accused of Nazi ties, I've dismissed it. Jack Carlson, the Democracy Manifest guy, would sometimes play up a Nazi persona as a dumb attempt at seeming tough and edgy because he spent most of his adult life in prison. John Brinkley, the goat gland doctor, admired Hitler in the 1930s, but he admired FDR too. He had progressive views on race when he ran for governor of Kansas, and I think he just wanted a strong leader to deal with the Great Depression and would be horrified to learn about what Hitler went on to do. David Woodard? I can't give him the benefit of the doubt. He too was no stranger to dumb attempts at seeming edgy, obviously, but everyone who spent time with him will tell you that racism was a genuine passion of his, to the extent that we can be sure anything was a genuine passion of his. He talked about this openly to the media. Multiple reporters who wrote long-form articles on his enigmatic presence in the LA arts scene in the 90s say Woodard handed them white supremacist pamphlets unprompted. When the neo-Nazi activist William Luther Pierce, infamous as the author of the Turner Diaries, died in 2002, Woodard wrote a memorial suite for him. And remember that weird bit about the feraliminal lycanthropizer? Another thing Woodard was in the early 2000s that'll probably surprise you more than him being a Nazi was an elected official. A very small-time one. Like, not an official governing body not capable of passing legally binding laws kind of small time. At this point, Woodard lived in Juniper Hills, California, a tiny unincorporated desert town on the opposite side of the San Gabriel Mountains from Los Angeles. Juniper Hills residents have an unofficial town council that they hold elections for, and in 2002, Woodard ran for a 2-year term on the council and won. The main thing he did as a Juniper Hills council member was establish a sister city relationship with Nueva Germania, Paraguay. After successfully lobbying the rest of the council to pass a resolution honoring this small South American jungle town as a sister city of Juniper Hills, calling Nueva Germania a, quote, quaint town with a musical background, Woodard publicized this relationship all over the place, getting buy-in from plenty of clueless institutions. A Kansas-based charity, Heart to Heart International, donated $12,500 worth of medicine to Nueva Germania on behalf of Juniper Hills. The Plasticos Foundation, an Orange County group of plastic surgeons who traveled to countries in the global south to do surgeries for people with physical deformities, also got on board thanks to Woodard's evangelism, putting out this statement: "We are concerned about severe phenotypic mutations accrued over 125 years of inbreeding and the profound effects these are likely to have on the daily life of Nueva Germania's inhabitants." In his most extraordinary publicity coup, Woodard somehow got a letter signed by then-incumbent Vice President Dick Cheney, celebrating Nueva Germania's sister city status. Alright, what shoe is gonna drop here? Well, what kind of a place has a name like Nueva Germania, New Germany? And what's with the 125 years of inbreeding? Nueva Germania, Paraguay was a Nazi colony, one that predated the actual Nazis. Friedrich Nietzsche. What does that name mean to you? You've probably heard of him. You probably know he was a 19th century German philosopher. If you can't name or explain a single idea of his, that's fine. His work was super dense. He wrote a lot about a ton of different subjects. There are some whole books of his where philosophers still debate what he meant, and as you'll see, some of the work credited to Nietzsche may not even have been written by him or expressed his own beliefs. But you probably have a vague sense of him as something of a bad boy. He was deeply cynical about religion, objectivity, and progress. He famously coined the phrase, "God is dead." One of his most influential ideas was master morality. He said that the whole Western Christian moral system is a morality designed to make slaves feel good about being slaves. Valorizing weakness, humbleness, equality, charity, community, Nietzsche believed that humanity grew to value these things in order to make Bronze Age peasants feel better about themselves. Heaven and hell were invented as a revenge fantasy against the powerful warlords and chieftains, he says. This is in contrast to master morality, which Nietzsche saw embodied in the strong-willed Greco-Roman hero archetype, who was unapologetic in his greatness and superiority to others. For a long time, it was considered common knowledge, and this may still be the main thing you think you know about Nietzsche, that Nietzsche's philosophy was an influence on the Nazis. From what I've already said, I think you can understand why, but Nietzsche himself was very clear about how he hated nationalism, hated anti-Semitism, and didn't really advocate for master morality to replace slave morality. It was just his theory about where morals came from. The most explicitly proto-Nazi elements of his writing were probably added after Friedrich's death by his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who was herself a hardline German nationalist and anti-Semite. In fact, she was so hardcore about Germany that in 1886 she left Germany, heading out to a place that felt like the very edge of the world, Paraguay. There, Förster Nietzsche and her husband, Bernhard Förster, founded a utopian settlement that was to be socialist, vegan, and completely free of Jews. A handful of other German families followed them, mostly people who had been in the social circles of the composer Richard Wagner, one of the biggest figures in pre-Nazi German nationalism. Wagner never went to Nueva Germania himself, but he contributed money toward the establishment of the colony. That's the musical background David Woodard talked about. Nueva Germania was a disaster. German people and German farming techniques were not a good fit for jungle life. The Germans starved and grew sick. They reluctantly began eating meat again because none of their crops would grow. Bernhard Förster, horrified at the master race's incompetence, drank rat poison in 1889, and the now widowed Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche returned to Germany, where she creatively edited her famous brother's books to make him say things he didn't say. She lived until 1935. Hitler gave her a sumptuous state funeral. Nueva Germania soldiered on. After giving up on veganism, one of their most important organizing tenets, the surviving residents gave up on their other biggest value too, racial purity. Most of them intermarried with the mostly indigenous locals and began speaking Guarani, the main language of Paraguay. Nueva Germania's controversial history became nothing but a curious local story. Of course, the ideology that founded Nueva Germania became much more popular, and then, spectacularly, collapsed. You're probably aware that after World War II, a lot of high-ranking Nazis fled to Argentina, and maybe you've thought, why Argentina? Well, it wasn't just Argentina. People who served in top roles in the Nazi Party, people wanted for war crimes by the Allies, spread out all over South America in the late 1940s. Why? Well, there were lots of German immigrants in most South American countries at the time who formed a powerful economic and political bloc in a lot of those countries, contributing to at least mildly pro-Nazi attitudes across Latin America during the war. The Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges wrote about how during the war, even though Argentina was neutral, the average man on the street in Buenos Aires sympathized with the Germans. South America was generally richer and more powerful then than it is now. None of the countries there had been directly involved in the war, and as the rest of the developed world had been blown to smithereens, there was one region former Nazis could go where they would be able to blend into existing German communities, where the cities and institutions were still intact, where the public would be less likely to mistrust them or rat them out for being Nazis, and when all else failed, there were countries big enough to disappear in. Some Nazis following the rat lines, as the networks that helped them escape justice were called, managed to make their way to Nueva Germania. Presumably they were disillusioned by the secluded Aryan utopia they were promised, turning out to be nothing more than another Paraguayan indigenous village where some people had German surnames. The infamous Nazi war criminal Josef Mengele, who did medical experiments on prisoners in Auschwitz, allegedly arrived in Nueva Germania in the early 1950s, but didn't stay long. He lived in another nearby town in Paraguay called Hohenau, also founded by Germans, but without an explicit eugenic goal, for a few years after that, and then lived in Brazil for the rest of his life, dying in 1979 of a stroke while going out for a swim in the ocean. Mengele was never brought to justice. Rumors have it that some families in Nueva Germania held true to their ideals of racial purity and, rather than interbreeding with locals, interbred with each other. This was the root of the claim from the plastic surgeons that the town was suffering from 125 years of inbreeding. I can't find a verified case of that, and it seems to be an urban legend. The New York Times sent a reporter to Nueva Germania in 2013 and found an ordinary, poor Paraguayan village where people mostly spoke Spanish and Guarani, where some residents were proud of their town's unique background but clearly didn't really believe anything Nazi adjacent, rather talking about Hitler and fascism with the detachment you sometimes get from people in countries where World War II was understood as just another great power struggle and Hitler isn't considered the pop culture embodiment of evil. I met a black South African once whose first name was Hitler. because to his family, the name's only connotations were power and bravery. If you watch Bollywood movies, sometimes you'll see people use Hitler as a casual nickname for someone who's a little harsh. That seems to be the perception today's residents of Nueva Germania have of their town's founders. They were weird and probably evil, but fundamentally foreigners who followed a strange foreign ideology they don't understand enough to hate. The only outward sign of the town's past was a street named after Elizabeth Nietzsche, which misspelled her name Elizabeth Nietzsche. And now back to the main story. David Woodard was not shy about the reason he was interested in Nueva Germania. He told the San Francisco Chronicle that he was, quote, drawn to the idea of an Aryan vacuum in the middle of the jungle and wanted to celebrate that. After traveling to Nueva Germania once, he claimed to have discovered some residents who held on to Nazi ideals and composed a 7-minute-long anthem for the community titled Our Jungle Holy Land. Some of the musicians who performed on it weren't told that it was an anthem promoting the town's history as a proto-Nazi colony, while others simply didn't seem to care. There was a David Woodard rat pack, people I know even less about, but he certainly seemed to have a clique of hangers-on, weird artists and musicians who shared some of his beliefs and vibes. Woodard hadn't told the town council of Juniper Hills why he wanted to set up a relationship with Nueva Germania either, and in 2003 he was kicked off the council, though not before the rest of the council discovered the website Woodard had made for the town was really his own website, using the URL juniperhills.net to link to his anthem, his promotion of Nueva Germania, and for good measure, Dream Machines, which he wasn't done promoting. In fact, to Woodard, the Dream Machine business was still ramping up. In his interview with the Chronicle, he talked about making impoverished Nueva Germania into something of a commercial hub for the Nazi psychedelia industry. In the house where local legend claimed Joseph Mengele had lived in the 50s, Woodard aspired to set up a Dream Machine factory, which would provide employment for, in Woodard's words, disillusioned Aryan youths. I don't know if he meant Aryan youths who already lived in Nueva Germania. As I've said, there weren't a lot of fully white people left there. They'd mostly intermarried with indigenous Paraguayans, or if he was planning to set up a commune for like-minded people where neo-Nazis from the Western world would come live in the jungle. If he was, he clearly hadn't read the history of Nueva Germania too well, but Woodard's talk of his ambitions for Nueva Germania certainly suggests that. He wanted to start a new Bayreuth, the German town where Richard Wagner started a theater to perform his works, and where Wagner's operas are still performed in an annual festival to this day. Woodard bought the crumbling house where Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche and her husband had lived, and planned to turn it into a replica of the Bayreuth Festival House, Wagner's concert hall. This was going to be funded with donations from Wagner fans. No money ever showed up. Woodard brought two other famous friends along with him to Paraguay, the Swiss novelist Christian Kracht, who would remain a close friend of Woodard up to, I think, the present day, and Kenneth Anger. If you're into queer history, Hollywood history, and anything in between, that's a name you know. Kenneth Anger was an experimental filmmaker and author from the 60s counterculture who ran in the same circles as William Burroughs. Like Burroughs, Anger's work was druggy and surreal, homoerotic at a time when that was sometimes literally illegal even in fiction, and involved with the occult. Anger was a follower of Thelema, the neo-pagan religion founded by Aleister Crowley, and one of the biggest promoters of the Dream Machine back in the 60s when it was being shopped around by Brian Geisen. That was what ingratiated Anger with David Woodard. It helped that Anger, in common with some others in the mid-20th century pagan scene, had white supremacist leanings himself. What became of the Nueva Germania project? Not much as far as I know. The third wave of ragtag weirdos who went down there to found their strange Aryan utopia seemed to have fared better than the first and second in the sense that they got out with their lives, but they too were probably waylaid by the struggles of living in the malarial jungle. Christian Kracht ended up publishing a novel based on the story of Nueva Germania in 2012. The 2013 New York Times article on the place doesn't mention Woodard, Anger, or Kracht, so clearly they didn't leave too much of a mark. Christian Kracht is a bit of a character too. He's a big deal in the German-speaking world, a writer of dense historical novels, some of which weave in alternate history. He received a nomination for the 2025 Nobel Prize in Literature. The less best-selling entries in his body of work feel very Woodardian. He wrote a play about L. Ron Hubbard once that has never been performed due to its requirement of a sacrifice of 100 live goats in one scene. In 2007, Kracht wrote a book supposedly arguing that climate change was the intentional result of a global conspiracy involving Jimmy Carter, Muammar Gaddafi, and aliens, which was sold as nonfiction and was generally assumed to be a satire of climate alarmism. He, too, has been accused of having fascist sympathies, although the allegation there is much more tenuous and seems to rest on he wrote alternate history novels where there are Nazis. In fact, the biggest sign that Kroc swings that way is probably his well-documented friendship with David Woodard. In 2008, Woodard moved to Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, where Kroc published a literary magazine from. While in Nepal, Woodard got back up to some very familiar hijinks by promising to compose a brass band salute to Charles Sobrage, a serial killer nicknamed the Bikini Killer, who murdered 20 hippie tourists in India and Southeast Asia in the 1970s. Due to Sobrage's charisma, intelligence, and the fact that his victims were strewn across several different countries that didn't all get along, Sobrage had mostly escaped justice for his crimes. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison in India, but he manipulated the guards into living a life of luxury behind bars. After 10 years inside, he feared that upon release he'd be extradited to Thailand, where most of his murders had taken place, and probably executed. So, Sobrage threw a wild party where he plied the guards with drugs and escaped, even though he was near the end of his sentence anyway. As he hoped, he was recaptured and his sentence in India was extended. By the time he was released in 1997, the statute of limitations for his crimes in Thailand had passed. After that, Sobrage returned to Paris, where he'd grown up with his stepdad, a French army officer who'd been stationed in Vietnam when it was a French colony. Unable to be charged in France, where he'd already served time for a childhood of petty crime and had nothing serious on his rap sheet, Sobrage lived as a celebrity, throwing ragers and charging exorbitant sums for interviews. In 2003, he returned to Nepal, one of the few countries that still had an outstanding arrest warrant against him, seemingly just to taunt the authorities, and was caught, charged, and imprisoned for his one known murder that had taken place in Nepal. When he appealed his case to the Supreme Court of Nepal, he had, of course, one supporter, David Woodard. Woodard is like a 5-year-old's image of a bad guy. He just supports anyone who's done bad shit for any reason. Woodard promised to get a brass band together and play in front of the Supreme Court when Sobrage's case was being heard. Christian Kroc, who had no musical background, purportedly co-composed the music. This didn't sway anyone. Charles Sobrage remained behind bars until 2022, when he was released for good behavior and deported to France. He lives there again now, 81 years old and a free man. Man, this episode, this is just like a fractal of Tor's Cabinet Stories. Is my background intact? Yeah, we're good. The would-be full episodes are growing like kudzu, and I'd already done an episode about the Corbin Bleu mystery on Wikipedia before I learned about the similar David Woodard mystery, which led me down this isn't a rabbit hole, this is a branching rabbit warren. It's as if David Woodard's entire life was just him begging to be covered on this channel. If I'd made my Corbin Bleu episode a few years earlier, I'd think that Woodard pulled off this publicity stunt I'm about to introduce precisely so that he could have a Tor's Cabinet episode on him. But he's wrong. He shouldn't have been a Tor's Cabinet episode. He and his Rolodex could have been a whole season's worth of episodes. This episode is already absolutely overstuffed, and we're not near the end. All right. It's finally time to talk about the thing that made me discover David Woodard. Wikipedia is currently available in 343 total languages, but most of the world's languages don't have a ton of coverage on the site. Let's look at another page that you can read in a lot of languages, the one for Corbin Bleu, which is among the most translated because of another entertaining rabbit hole that you'll have to watch the dedicated video I made to learn about. 217 languages as of late, well over half the languages there are wiki pages in. Let's check out the page in, say, Cherokee syllabics. See, you don't have to read Cherokee to know there's not a lot here. I keep saying Corbin Bleu's page used to be one of the most translated, but this isn't a translation, it's a separate, shorter article. Actually translating full Wikipedia articles isn't something people usually do. As a language that doesn't have a lot of speakers today, Cherokee Wikipedia consists largely of short articles on the broadest topics and best-known people. Same with the Wikipedias in most languages that aren't the main language of a country. If there's a language on Wikipedia, it'll probably have a page for Corbin Bleu. It's even more likely to have pages for the Earth, the Sun, a large array of countries, and Wikipedia itself, all of which have more translations than Corbin Bleu. There is not a single Wikipedia page that you can read in all 343 represented languages, nor has there ever been, but some get awfully close. Currently, the page for the United States can be read in 326 languages, I wonder what the 17 languages that have Wikipedia sites but don't have a page for the US are. I'm not sure there's a way to find out beyond just painstakingly sifting through them. Few pages have ever surpassed the 326 for the US. One that did, after years of gradual rise, from fall 2024 to summer 2025, was the page for David Woodard. The 335 languages that David Woodard's article could be read in at its peak still probably marks the most translations any Wikipedia page has ever had other than the main page. I don't think there's any other article where under 10 languages on Wikipedia don't have it. But the coverage of Woodard's berserk life wasn't very complete in any language. In English, which is the language with the biggest Wikipedia, and of course Woodard's native language, so you'd expect it to be the most complete summary of Woodard's life, it notably did not include his promotion of a neo-Nazi colony. Are you going to be surprised to learn who's responsible for that? Okay, we don't have a smoking gun, but who else would it be? Until right now, who else cared about David Woodard? The Wikipedia power user Gernachrist, who recommends the pronunciation Gren, laid things out for all to see in an August 2025 article uncovering, quote, the single largest self-promotion operation in Wikipedia's history, spanning over a decade and covering as many as 200 accounts and even more proxy IP addresses. Bringing this scheme to light was quite a bit easier than finding the culprit behind the Corbin Blue wiki mystery. Woodard did not cover his tracks particularly well. Dozens, possibly hundreds of the David Woodard articles across the many Wikipedias had been added by a single user, with the username Swimming, with the vowels removed. The first article Swimming created had been that of Sonia Vektomov, a Czech artist who was, according to the Woodard article, David Woodard's now wife. The Vektomov article featured a photo of her that Swimming claimed to have taken himself. Other than David Woodard, Swimming primarily edited English language articles related to Czech artists and classical music. Swimming had also removed content on the English David Woodard article about Woodard's interest in Nazism. Despite the massive number of articles Swimming had created in various languages for David Woodard and their Czech IP address, they never created a Czech language article for Woodard. The Czech article was the work of another one of his sock puppets. When he wasn't using the Swimming account, Woodard's MO brought to mind the man spinning a great big VPN roulette wheel, picking an IP address from somewhere far-flung and then adding machine-translated articles about himself in obscure languages that didn't have anything to do with the IP address he was using. Hence, an IP address from South Korea added a page for David Woodard in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language of the Amish. An IP from Finland added a page in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, as well as Kirundi, spoken in the tiny African country of Burundi. I doubt there is a single person in South Korea who speaks Pennsylvania Dutch, nor a single person in Finland who speaks Nahuatl. Many of the IP addresses were based in Czechia, the same place Swimming was from, the same place David Woodard seems to live now. All of this took place in two waves, one in 2019 and then later resuming after COVID and lasting until 2024, now with increased detail on all the pages that were being created. At one point, the pages in most major languages all simultaneously added that David Woodard's middle name is James, something that appears in no published sources about him. A new photo of Woodard was added to most of the pages in April 2020 by a variety of IP addresses in Hong Kong. The photo was apparently taken in Prague very recently. Given that the world was under COVID lockdowns at that point, that should raise some questions about who took the photo. Links to Woodard's page were inserted into the pages for Nueva Germania and for the Dream Machine, which are defensible, I think, but also for pliers, which Woodard had once used instead of a baton to conduct a symphony, and for the Brown Pelican, because that symphony had been written to memorialize a pelican that had been killed by an LA beachgoer. Yeah, I didn't even include that part yet, because it's weird even for David Woodard. The crank theory that Woodard's Dream Machine killed Kurt Cobain appeared on the English and French versions of Cobain's wiki page. Woodard had been sock puppeting for a pretty long time, it turns out. Back in 2015, an account was created called Judge-tastic, also with a Czech IP address, also primarily showing an interest in English language pages for Czech artists. Judge-tastic went on to create a wiki quote page for David Woodard and an English wiki article on the feraliminal lycanthropizer. An account called C. Wells, once again with a Czech IP address, seriously, has David Woodard never heard of VPNs? Added a 2008 photograph of Woodard and Christian Kracht at Cabinet Voltaire, a quirky art space in Zurich that birthed the Dada movement in the 1910s, with yet another controversial terrorism-related celebrity, Ma Anand Sheila. If Sheila could see me now. This is a story that I've wanted to tell on Tor's Cabinet for a long time. It has a lot of my favorite things in it. Cults, Oregon, India. I know I'm sort of known as a China guy, and I won't reject that, but I spent 3 months in India as a teenager as well, and I actually met some continuing members of this cult that I'm about to talk about while I was there. But this is an Oregon story through and through. Mention the Rajneeshis to an Oregonian of a certain age, and they'll know exactly what you're talking about. It'll bring up memories of orange robes, Rolls Royces, a climate of fear spreading across the state, and the grassroots movement to kick them out that began to feel like an existential battle for the soul of Oregon. For a while, bumper stickers that said, "Antelope, better dead than red," were ubiquitous in the state, especially in the dry, dusty, conservative eastern part that resembles Utah or Wyoming more than it does people's stereotypes of Oregon. Okay, who were the Rajneeshis? The Rajneeshis were a new religious movement, which isn't always a euphemism for a cult, but usually is, who started in India in the 1960s. Originally, they were started by Indians for Indians, but they were a pro-Western movement. Their founder was a college philosophy lecturer named Chandra Mohan Jain, who spent his life going by his childhood nickname, Rajneesh. He had been interested in communism and anarchism in his teens, but those currents seem to have become too mainstream for Rajneesh. By the 60s, India was officially socialist and closely aligned with the USSR. He set out to preach something truly transgressive for his time and place, something that truly hadn't been tried in India. In the West, the 60s were marked by a wave of interest in Indian spirituality, but the ideological currents went both ways. In India, the 60s were marked by a wave of interest in Western high modernity. While Western hippies talked about how Indian culture has so much to teach the West about meditation and asceticism, their opposite number talked about how Western culture has so much to teach India about capitalism, technocracy, and social liberalism. The most successful such preacher was Rajneesh. His teachings were still largely rooted in Hinduism, but he slammed mainstream Hindus as austerity-loving masochists whose values were keeping India poor. He introduced Western philosophers like Nietzsche and Freud to India, celebrating science, technology, and especially birth control as the antithesis of the stodgy Hindu establishment Rajneesh wanted to break up. Like any good cult leader, he had lots of sex, and encouraged his followers to do the same. At the same time, Westerners were becoming interested in free love and drugs and strange new forms of meditation, claiming inspiration from Eastern spirituality. Indians under Rajneesh were doing all the same things, claiming this was what had made the West successful. In 1974, Rajneesh opened an ashram in Pune, a major city southeast of Mumbai, which became the world headquarters for his growing movement. He now had thousands of followers, which he called sannyasins, a term from Hinduism meaning purified ones, or originally someone who has renounced all material possessions. That clearly wasn't the meaning Rajneesh intended, though, because his religion was all about material possessions. Rajneesh was very proud of his ever-growing Rolls Royce collection, for instance. I think this element of Rajneeshism is just such a fascinating example of how the grass is always greener on the other side. Of course, the Indian equivalent of hippies wouldn't be into renouncing material possessions. What was new and progressive and paradigm-shifting to them, living in a poor and officially socialist country, was coveting material possessions. Open materialism and consumerism, filtered through a Hindu lens with orange robes, meditation, and Sanskrit terminology, wasn't exactly what Western hippies wanted at the time, so most of Rajneesh's followers early on were Indian, but sannyasins began to trickle in from across the world. And like the hippies in America, Rajneesh began to land on the bad side of his country's established political and religious authorities. India's constitution nominally guarantees freedom of religion, but Rajneesh and his movement were deeply unpopular with the mainstream sects of Hinduism. By the late 70s, Rajneesh's personal secretary and possibly lover, a sharp Gujarati woman who'd gone to college in New Jersey, Ma Anand Sheila, began to urge Rajneesh to relocate his flock to the United States. The next arc in the history of the Rajneeshis was mostly Sheila's work. Some sannyasins whispered that she was running the whole show at this point, and Rajneesh himself was relegated to a figurehead. He would drive by in his many Rolls Royces, requiring the sannyasins to salute him, but he never spoke in public, even to his own followers. Sheila found a ranch for sale in rural eastern Oregon. In 1981, Rajneesh and thousands of his followers moved there, establishing the town of Rajneeshpuram, or Rajneesh City, out of nowhere. Initially, they lived in identical yellow army tents. By 1984, Rajneeshpuram had a wide array of businesses, a functioning sewer system, a fire department, a public bus network, and an airport. 3 Douglas DC-3s flew regular flights from Rajneeshpuram to Portland under the name Air Rajneesh. The official population was 7,000, but locals and sannyasins alike speculated that this was a deliberate undercount and tens of thousands may have lived there at its peak. Not everyone there was even a follower of Rajneeshism, as we'll see. Sheila had her sights on far more than establishing a town in Oregon. Today, Wasco County, Oregon, tomorrow the world. The area where Rajneeshpuram was established was desolate scrubland. The nearest existing town was Antelope, population 60, a half-hour drive away. Despite its minuscule population, Antelope was an incorporated town. The state government wouldn't let Rajneeshpuram incorporate as a city because it was a theocracy, and that violated the separation of church and state. But Antelope wasn't a theocracy, right? Antelope was just a ordinary little town in eastern Oregon, right? They wouldn't mind if a handful of Rajneeshis moved into town, right? And started voting, and running for the town council, and passing a motion to annex Rajneeshpuram into the town of Antelope? At this point, Oregonians were scared. The state attorney general, Dave Frohnmeyer, began trying to charge them with something, but what? Technically, everything they were doing was legal. The slow-growth activist group 1,000 Friends of Oregon got involved, proposing that they take away the Rajneeshis' political power by disincorporating Antelope as a town. The movement gained statewide support, and 1,000 Friends of Oregon passed out bumper stickers saying Antelope was, quote, better dead than red, a reference to the robes worn by the sannyasins, which I'm pretty sure were really orange. But ultimately, the only people who had the power to decide on disincorporating Antelope were Antelope's voters, who were vastly outnumbered by the sannyasins. The ballot measure to disincorporate was defeated in a landslide. The next ballot measure was to rename Antelope to Rajneesh. It passed. In a truly strange twist that even the Rajneeshis couldn't have seen coming, an American convert to radical Islam set off a pipe bomb at a hotel the Rajneeshis owned in Portland. Locals believed it was a false flag, but it really seemed not to be. This increased the sense among the Rajneeshis that they were under attack, and Sheila began forming a paramilitary force to protect Rajneeshpuram. Now visitors to Rajneeshpuram were greeted by the Rajneesh Peace Force, as it was known, brandishing assault rifles. And they weren't going to stop there. The county where they lived had under 100,000 residents in the first place. That would be easy enough to take control of, right? Quite where Sheila's dreams of domination ended were unclear. Other than simply power, what did she want? Maybe, charitably, to be left alone. If she had a rural Oregon county completely under her thumb, maybe she'd have stopped there, but who knows? Sheila went on the press circuit, defiantly proclaiming her right to do everything she was doing, claiming she and the Rajneeshis were being oppressed by bigoted Oregonians. Rajneeshi candidates announced campaigns for open seats on the county commission, district court, and delegations to the state Republican convention. By this point, most residents of Rajneeshpuram were American citizens. Many of the Indian sannyasins had entered into sham marriages with the American sannyasins in order to skip ahead in the immigration queue. Shams because Rajneeshism officially discouraged families and childbearing. But they didn't have enough citizens to outvote the whole county, yet. Sheila sent out buses from Rajneeshpuram to most of America's major cities, where sannyasins were ordered to pick up homeless people off the streets on the promise of free beer if they came back to Rajneeshpuram, registered to vote, and voted for Rajneeshi candidates. Some of them had to be drugged. Once they arrived in Rajneeshpuram by the thousands, drunken brawls began breaking out between the sannyasins and the new arrivals. A county judge caught wind of the Rajneeshis' scheme and stopped new voter registrations in Wasco County. Rats, foiled again, said Sheila, but not for long. In the Dalles, the county seat, home to about half of Wasco County's population, people began to get sick. It initially just seemed like a stomach bug was going around. Maybe it was the flu, but it was late summer. Perhaps the omnipresent forest fire smoke that hangs over Oregon at that time of year was messing people up. No, that couldn't be it. It was getting worse. People were getting hospitalized. The governor sent in state health inspectors. The state health inspectors called in the CDC. The verdict? Salmonella, one of the biggest outbreaks in American history. It was further traced back to, 10 different restaurants? All the most popular restaurants in the Dalles, which did not all have a single supplier in common, seemed to be contaminated with salmonella. This was deliberate. This was bioterrorism. Not long afterward, Rajneesh broke his 4-year vow of silence. He revealed the entire plan, which he claimed he wasn't aware of until after it had been carried out. This was a dry run, masterminded by Sheila and 12 other members of the upper echelon of Rajneeshpuram. A bigger salmonella attack was planned in November to sicken the county's voting population right around Election Day so that the residents of the Dalles couldn't go to the polls, but the Rajneeshis could. I was going to say, joke's on her, Oregon doesn't have polling places and conducts all our elections by mail only, but that policy actually only dates to 1998. Rajneeshpuram was raided by the feds, with Rajneesh's own cooperation, indicating that this really did seem to all be Sheila's handiwork that Rajneesh himself was horrified by. The FBI found a lab where Sheila and her team had been cooking up salmonella, as well as deadlier diseases, bombs, and elaborate plots to murder the U.S. Attorney for Oregon and a journalist investigating Rajneeshpuram. Rajneeshpuram fell apart after this. Most of the sannyasins were disgusted at the revelation that their leaders had committed a terror attack. Many in the rank and file suspected that Rajneesh knew about the plot all along, but the feds were never able to charge him with anything related to it. He was indicted on 35 counts of immigration fraud, and instead of serving time, the feds got him to agree to a deal to take his cult back to India, which he dutifully did. There he became even more popular, successfully making hay from the narrative that he'd been persecuted by the Americans. He spent the rest of the 80s jet-setting around the world, living nearly everywhere but the US for a few months at a time, adopting the name Osho in 1989. His health got worse, and he died 1 year later, at his ashram in India, of unclear causes at just 58. Some suspect Sheila had deliberately infected him with something back in Oregon. As for Sheila, she and her nurse Ma Anand Puja, no relation, those were both names they took on after they joined the Rajneeshis, they fled from Oregon to Germany, where they were extradited back to Oregon, tried, and sentenced. Sheila served just 29 months of what was originally intended as a decades-long prison term before she was released for good behavior in 1988 and moved to Switzerland. There, she purportedly runs nursing homes. She's 75 now, and most likely still alive. To this day, the photo atop her Wikipedia page shows her doing a panel about God knows what in 2008 in Zurich with Christian Kracht and David Woodard. In the annals of dangerous, powerful cults on American soil, possibly only the People's Temple and Scientology compare to the Rajneeshis under Ma Anand Sheila, and it's crazy that it's only common knowledge in Oregon. The salmonella attack in the Dalles is still the second worst bioterror attack in American history. The current site of Rajneeshpuram is now a Christian summer camp. Some of the prefab houses sannyasins lived in were relocated to another nearby summer camp run by the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, OMSI, and I worked there in the summer of 2022. The only reason I didn't already do an episode about the Rajneeshis long ago is because I try not to cover stories that have already been done well by a YouTube channel I like or have a good professional documentary about them, and Rajneeshpuram has both. If you want more detail, check out the episode of Down the Rabbit Hole, one of my all-time favorite channels, and if you want way more detail, check out the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country. And now, back to David Woodard. By 2024, Woodard's MO on Wikipedia consisted of creating one-use alt accounts on the Wikipedias in obscure languages, waiting the requisite amount of time to be allowed to create a new page, posting a brief, machine-translated page for David Woodard, and then disappearing. Many editors of Wikipedias in little-known languages were thrilled to have a new member eager to add more pages in their given language, and were crushed when it turned out to be a self-promotion scam. The project was still in progress, still adding a new language approximately once a week, all the way into summer 2025, and had Gren not noticed it, and I think my Corbin Blue episode played a role in exposing Woodard's scheme as well, by now David Woodard would have been the first person, concept, or thing to have a Wikipedia page in every single language Wikipedia is available in. He would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for us meddling kids. Today, David Woodard is about 60 years old. He lives in Europe, probably in Prague. I'm not sure if there's a way to listen to any of his compositions, most of which were probably never even recorded with the full arrangements he intended. There's a pop-punk musician on Spotify and Bandcamp under the name David Woodard, but I got in contact with that guy and he confirmed he had never heard of the weird David Woodard. Do listen to his stuff, it's good and catchy. Woodard has led a surprisingly successful life. His whole life has been driven by the goal of being known as a famous, controversial weirdo, and now he's a famous, controversial weirdo. His Wikipedia scam seems to be what finally put him over the top, and this episode will help too. I have a feeling that if David Woodard sees this video, he'll be happy, even with his Nazi side laid bare. Woodard is something of a Forrest Gump of weirdos, the Thanos of the Tours Cabinet cinematic universe. I feel icky about celebrating him, but I feel like I can't not turn him into a recurring character in this channel's legendarium. He's not dead yet, and not that old either. God knows what he'll be doing when he turns up next, but I can't truthfully say I'm not curious. I can't promise this will be the last time you hear about him on Tours Cabinet. Only Woodard can promise that, and it would surprise me if he furled his freak flag now. As for Wikipedia, it remains the internet's last best place. You don't tug on Superman's cape. You don't spit in the face of the media. You don't pull the mask off the old Lone Ranger, and you don't mess around with Wikipedia. Making your own obscure self into the most translated page of all time on Wikipedia is definitely the most extraordinary Wikipedia grift of all time, but he did it because he was obscure. Anyone who's a bigger deal than, well, Corbin Blue will have any chicanery around their Wikipedia page discovered in a heartbeat. David Woodard flew under the radar. David Woodard was able to do this because damn near nobody looks at the Wikipedia page for David Woodard. And again, Wikipedia is a storehouse of information. Did this affect the actual information on the site? No, it didn't. Even when Woodard tried to scrub the reference to his fascist sympathies off his wiki page, other editors added it right back. The worst crime David Woodard committed on Wikipedia was letting speakers of tiny isolated languages know who he is. And there aren't that many people who exclusively speak tiny isolated languages and also use Wikipedia. The smallest Wikipedias are really language preservation projects first and foremost. Every case of successful wiki vandalism is an exception that proves the rule. Wikipedia ain't nothing to fuck with. Woodard's page is down to just 13 languages now, the only ones where Gran and the other admins could be reasonably sure they weren't created by a Woodard alt. There are no mysteries left in the top 100 most translated Wikipedia articles. The top spot is now held by Turkey, the country, with 332 translations, just short of Woodard's max of 335. But that's not a mystery. There's a substantial Turkish nationalist presence on the internet. It is what it is. Albania and Finland are also rather obscure countries to see in the top 10, but I've been to Finland and I can tell you, Finns are crazy proud of their country. Heard of something called the Winter War? And it's also a country of nerds, possibly the most culturally autistic place on Earth. Of course the Finns love editing Wikipedia. I assume something similar is going on with Albania. The rest of the top articles are pretty much all countries. Jesus of Nazareth has been restored to the top spot for people. But wait, above Jesus himself, the highest ranking religion-related article on the whole site belongs to the True Jesus Church. Wait, I've heard of the True Jesus Church. They're like a Pentecostal movement in China who seem to have a really good Wikipedia ground game. All right, curious people, time to go back down the rabbit hole.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. A loaded question will break your bones. What puts you on your knees?